by the Handful. Written by Starr Ferris and read for you by Steve Gray. Somewhere in the middle of a Kansas field, a cornfield to be exact, stood a haggard life-sized doll, hung atop a tall pole, stuffed with straw, dressed in torn jeans and a plaid shirt. Upon its burlap head, tipped off to one side, was a large floppy hat. The expression on this odd fellow's face was one of a constant frown, seen in thick black thread. His dull button eyes peeked out from underneath the brim of the ridiculous bonnet. The sun beat down upon it day in and day out, encouraging the mildew scent that emanated from it. It sat in that cornfield all season long, attempting in some foolish manner to scare away the hordes of animals and birds that longed to steal the crop. At the end of each season, it was brought down by the owner of the farm and stored away in a musty old basement. Such was the life of this tired old sack. It was by no means glamorous, but there was a sense of duty and pride in what it stood for. The guardian of the farm. It was one particularly rainy afternoon the lonely fellow carried out his duties, sodden and somber. Through the damp and cold, an old Subaru bombed up the farmer's drive. The driver of the car was a middle-aged salesman, attempting to trek through the muddy pothole-infested driveway. He held a cup of lukewarm coffee in one hand while steering with his other. Hitting a bump, he spilled the dark Java down the front of his white-pressed shirt. Shouting at the mess, but thankful he hadn't been hit, he continued his uneven stumble over a few more holes before reaching the end. The farmer that lived in the century-old home lived with his wife and dog. The undemanding couple lived a slow lifestyle free from the hurried pace that their solicitor frequented. They hadn't much money. They hadn't any children, but were content in their sensible accomplishments on the farm and their 50-year marriage. The fast-talking salesman worked his way into the door and pitched to them. With fancy lingo, bright flyers, and complicated figures, he easily swayed the two to opt into products they did not need, for money they did not have. With the sleight of hand that rivaled the hand of a seasoned magician, the wit of a scientist, and the morals of a con man, he swindled the unsuspecting duo with hardly any effort at all. He left smiling, quite proud of himself, and checked off another notch on his card. Thus was the life of this salesman. As months passed, and spring gave way to summer, the elderly farmer and his wife found themselves among difficult times. The money has somehow run through their fingers at the unwelcome help from the salesman. They were barely getting by and feared what their outlook held. They had already borrowed too much from the bank and were unable to do so further. There was no secret stash waiting on a rainy day. The two were out of options, looking at a bleak future. When the foreclosure papers were served to the home, it was clear their tiny boat was sinking. One evening, just 2 days after receiving the devastating news, the farmer stood in his cornfield, wringing his hands and holding back tears. He looked around. The field was illuminated by a bright white moon. He paced around, going over and over in his head all of the things that he had done wrong, from the time he signed the salesman's papers to all of the choices he had made financially since, in an attempt to bail himself out. He was ashamed. He knelt down in the dirt, picking up the soft, lush soil by the handful and letting it sit through his worn fingers. He had taken care of the farm for a long time, and it was unfathomable to him that he would have to leave. He sat there for a long time, taking in the sights, sounds, and smells of the field. When he finally stood, the knees of his faded blue coveralls saturated with the wet earth. He turned around and noticed the trusty old scarecrow hanging doodly from its post. The farmer smiled at the old friend, who never complained, working every day in the burning sun. He walked to it and ran his fingers over the frayed fabric, feeling a sense of self-disappointment and guilt. "I've failed us, old boy, and now we are going to lose everything. I'm so sorry. If only there was a way to pay off the debt, to get our money back, there might be a chance. But I don't see how that can happen now. That money is long gone." The farmer choked back tears. Time had run out. The only thing left to do now was to go back to the house and start packing. He slowly left the field and returned to his wife, who was just setting the table for dinner. Not too far from the farm, up a stretch of country road, was a run-down motel. That shifty salesman who had conned the farmer just months earlier was back in town to make a few more deals. His room was tiny, stuffy, and reeked of cheap cleaning chemicals. The breathless stagnancy of the discount abode overpowered his lungs, and the broken air conditioner was of no help to his cause. He opened the window by his bed, hoping for some sort of relief, only to be hit in the face by the hot night air. He cursed his conditions. His job dragged him through all kinds of towns and cities, scamming his way along, hoping to make the big break. All of that hard work and effort was finally going to pay off. He had just completed some of his best work yet. That he had brought in a hoard of money from a big-wig fat cat from the next town over. He sat upon the stained comforter of his rickety bed and smiled proudly at his accomplishment. His leather briefcase sat directly in front of him on the bed. In the tinged lighting of the dank room, he opened the satchel in wonder and glee. He hadn't taken a moment's hesitation when the customer had written the check out to him. He cashed it immediately and filled the case with the beautiful color of green. His plans after this last stop would prove to be a bit tricky for the man, but nothing he had any fear to follow through with. Instead of wiring the usual cut to his other partners, he would take the entire lot and disappear. It was a plan he had been hatching for a while, and now that it was on the edge of fruition, he sat lightly as a caged songbird awaiting for the metal door to open. He grabbed wads of cash by the handful from inside the case and counted through each one, giggling like a child as it reached a higher and higher count. When he finished the task, he tucked them safely back inside and closed the lid. He would rise early in the morning and set out on his new life. No more dirty hotels, stale coffee, and spending countless hours in strangers' kitchens spinning webs of lies to scrape by. He could imagine himself sitting on a beach, taking in all the glory of his win. He chuckled to himself and went to the bathroom to clean up before bed. The dingy drapes that hung around the window rustled as something entered the room. There was not a breath of wind that summer night to be blamed for the movement of those curtains. The salesman hummed to himself as he shut off the bathroom light, followed by the main light to his room, and made his way to bed. He crawled onto it, knowing it would be a hard night's sleep with his mind racing the way it was, aided by the oppressive heat. He laid down, relaxing for a moment. He closed his eyes and sighed. It wasn't long before he opened them again, unable to let sleep come. He stared across the room, lost in his own thoughts. His eyes rested upon an unfamiliar shadow in the corner. It was hard to make out, the dark pile that took up residence in the crook of the room. He tried to strain his eyes to see what it might be, to no avail. He shrugged it away, not wanting to deal with the task of getting up and inspecting what more than likely was nothing at all. He rolled over in bed and stared at the blank wall. It was no more than a couple of minutes from that time that he was startled by a sudden noise. He held his breath, waiting to hear the noise again. It came again, a soft shuffling, the sound of fabric rubbing together. The salesman remained in his position facing the wall, still listening intently. The room was silent, so he let out his breath, thinking himself silly for worrying. Then the sound came again, only this time it was definitely closer. The soft shuffle lasted a bit longer this time, and when it stopped, sounded as if it had stopped right directly behind him. The salesman was now certain he had heard the noises, and that something was in his room, perhaps right behind his back. He felt a combination of gripping fear and anger. Possibly someone had known about his money, maybe had been watching him count it from outside his window. He had no weapon, but would not allow himself to be robbed of his own happiness. He got himself ready, bracing and starting a count within his head. When he got to 3, he would turn around and face the trespasser. 1, 2, 3. He wiped his body around, arms in defense of whoever was there. His courage melted away like a candle in fire. Instead, a nightmarish scream escaped the depths of his throat. Every hair on his entire body stood up at attention. There, only 2 inches from the screaming man's face, was a worn, burlap sack of a head, 2 black buttons for eyes, a sad frown sewn into thread. The pitiful salesman clutched his chest, feeling his heart unable to handle the barrage of pure, radiant fear that whisked through his veins. His eyes were unable to process what they were seeing. The horrid-looking doll stood up, the height of a full-grown man, towering menacingly over the squirming pile of nerves that was the salesman. His shouts of terror fell silent on the non-existent ears of the dusty old chap in the plaid shirt. Eventually, the sleepy half-wit behind the front desk of the hotel was awakened by the screams. He threw on his slippers and hurried out the door. By the time he found the source of the screams, they had died down completely. He fumbled with his roll of keys, trying to get the right one. He eventually found the key and opened the door. He searched the wall and found the light switch. The dark, musty room was soon filled with artificial light. The horror that was unveiled was unspeakable. The poor salesman had for the longest time been filled with nothing but greed and self-promotion, but that had been remedied that night. He had been filled with straw. As morning broke on the farmer made one last trek to the cornfield to take down his scarecrow and put him away for the last time. When he reached the center where the trusty old fellow hung, he was overcome with surprise. There on the post sat his old friend, now with a smile sewn proudly on his face. Poking out from all of the areas that used to reveal straw were now crisp green bills. As the old farmer would find, the entire body of the doll was filled with money. More than he and his wife would need to get back on their feet and live comfortably again. The farmer and his wife got their farm back, and never again had to worry about crows, rabbits, or the occasional salesman that dared venture too close to their prospects.